Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950, today we'll talk about the commercialization of agriculture, as we have talked about the other themes in this particular paper, that how a commercialization of agriculture which was conducted by the British during that particular period was one of the things which they did so as to maximize the revenue, to get the revenue in cash. And at the same time, from the international point of view also, we find that some kinds of supplies, they were being disrupted, and various cash crops which could not be sent to Britain at that point of time, and they wanted to create an area in India where they could in a way produce those crops, and those crops were very vital to the industries which were there in Britain. So the domestic factors as well as the international influences, both of them in a way contributed to the commercialization of agriculture in India. So we find that commercialization of agriculture has often been criticized on the ground that a lot of coercion was exercised by the British in terms of commercializing the agriculture in India. And we have also seen that how the commercialization of various crops, whether indigo, sugarcane, cotton, etc., all of them in a way contributed in some sense to the misery of the agriculturalists. So we will try to see that what were the factors which were important in the context of commercialization of agriculture in India, and within the framework of the larger colonial policy which was followed by the British. And at the same time, we'll also try to talk about the individual crops and the kind of changes in terms of agricultural practices which came with the introduction of commercialization of agriculture, and also the kind of impact which was there of this device or this kind of a policy which was known as the commercialization of agriculture. With regard to the sources, one can talk about B.L. Grover and Introduction to Modern India, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay's Palasi to Partition, B.B. Chaudhry's Growth of Commercial Agriculture in Bengal, and the IGNOU source material. So all these kinds of materials one can refer when one is talking about the commercialization of agriculture. And when one is talking about the commercialization of agriculture, then we see that how the production of certain crops for the market purposes is the important aspect, rather than these crops which are there for subsistence. And when British, they indulged in the commercialization of agriculture, we find that how British, they needed these products to further their industrial development. And the contemporary global developments, they also in a way created this kind of a situation that they went for the commercialization of agriculture. And the kind of policy which was followed by the British in India, where they in a way indulged in commercialization of the crops. This can also be in a way related to the kind of changes which came in the British industry, as well as we find in the context of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, which forced the government to follow the mercantilist policies which were advantageous to the industries. So this meant that how the creation of India into a market for the British goods was to be done, and a source of raw material for the industries in Britain, and also a source of other cash crops which could use to benefit its economy. So these were some of the kind of things which we see in the commercialization of agriculture, and how through the various kinds of revenue settlements we find that how British, they insisted on collecting the revenue in cash, and they felt that it was very difficult to collect the revenue in kind. So we find that how the agriculturalists, they shifted from the cultivation of the food grains to that of the cash crops, and how the East India Company in a way offered them some kind of incentives to grow the cash crops. And that is how we find that how the private traders, they gave advances in terms of loans to the agriculturalists. And when we find that cash crops, they were being grown on the larger scale from this time. So we find that the kind of policy which was in a way unleashed by the British in terms of the emphasis on the cash crops, because of which more and more cash crops, they were being grown in India. We also talked about in the framework of the changes which were happening in the international level, and we find that because of the French Revolution, the indigo cultivation collapsed, and the Napoleonic continental blockade, it resulted in the stoppage of supply of silk to England. We also see that the American Civil War and the revolt of slaves in America working on the British plantations, they stopped supply of cotton and indigo. So in that sense, we find that these kinds of international influences, whether the French Revolution, which was connected to the indigo cultivation, or how Napoleon, who engaged in continental blockade, which in a way resulted in the stoppage of the supply of silk to England, and the kind of changes which could be seen in America in the context of the Civil War and the revolt of slaves. So some or the other crops, in the case of America it was cotton, how these kinds of crops, they were affected in terms of the supplies to Britain, and Britain needed all these crops, all these materials to further its industrial development. As we are aware that the industrial revolution which began in Europe, especially in Britain in 1740s onwards, and they needed a lot of raw materials for their industries. Then we also see, apart from the influences we have talked about, the Taipei rebellion in China, it stopped the export of tea from China to Britain, and the Crimean War, which was there in 1853-54, it stopped the supply of jute from Russia to Britain. Another important factor was the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, which further helped in this particular process. We have also seen the other developments, the telegraphic contact between India and England from 1855 onwards further favored the cultivation of cash crops as foreign trade became easier. So apart from the earlier discussed international influences, we also see that how other things, whether in the context of Russia or China or opening of the Suez Canal, all of them they played an important role in the context of different crops. We also see that how, when you talk about the commercialization of agriculture, then it was inevitable in that sense. Ashok Sen has argued in this regard, and he has said that it was an essential feature of the emergence and consolidation of capitalism. And he has also talked about that such a process is imbricated with the dualities and regional variations as well, especially in the colonial countries, in this case particularly India. And it is also not possible to homogenize the historical impact of commercialization, in that sense that how commercialization affected the different regions in different ways, because the different crops they were involved in, the cultivation of the crops was one important aspect, and how the different regions they got affected because of the commercialization of agriculture is to be understood, or in a way seen in the framework of the regional variations. But at the same time, one has to also see that despite the regional variations, the main crux in the framework of the impact was that how various peasants from different regions, they were being forced by the colonial government in that sense to indulge in commercialization of agriculture, and coercion was an important component of this commercialization during the colonial period. We have also seen that other scholars, they have in a way tried to talk about the internal developments of the communications, especially the railways linked village economy with the urban market economy, and how thus in a way generated the demand as well. And we see that the growth in the internal industries also led to the growth of cash crops as well. So in this context, when you talk about the scholars, B.B. Chaudhary is one who has seen these kinds of developments, and how railways in a way helped in that sense, that how the economy, the urban economy was in a way linked with the market economy, because the crops from the rural regions, they were being sent to the urban areas so that they could be exported to Britain. And we also see that during this time some of the internal industries also grew in India. For that matter, when you talk about the handicrafts industry, which was already existing in that sense, and they also needed some kind of crops as well for making products. And when we talk about the various kinds of crops, for example indigo, by 1840 we see that indigo had firmly established as the largest dyeing material which was used in the world. And the units of production, they were being run by the British investor, and two types of cultivation they were carried on. One was the Najabad, or the cultivation directly undertaken under the supervision of the British investors with the help of the hired labor. So we find that how in the various kinds of crops which were being cultivated by the British, different kinds of cultivation, different kinds of cultivation practices, they were being undertaken at that point of time, as we talked about Najabad in the context of the indigo cultivation. And one of the important aspects with regard to indigo is that how when indigo is being cultivated, the land becomes infertile. So many of the farmers many a times are not ready to cultivate indigo because their land will become barren. So we find that how British, they engaged in the sense of forcing the farmers to engage themselves in the cultivation of indigo. And another system was Rayati, where the contract system in which small farmers, they grew indigo on their lands and received advances from the East India Company merchants, those who were associated with the East India Company. And we find that peasants, they were bearing the expenses of the cultivation and had to hand over the entire produce to planters at the fixed price. And this system also involved coercion as well. And we find that the low prices, they were being fixed by the investor, and the peasants found it impossible to extricate himself from the debt. So the kind of advances which were being given to the peasants by maybe the merchants at that point of time, so we find that low amounts or they were being fixed by the investors, the people, those who were giving advances to the cultivators or farmers. And so this had some kind of a negative impact on the peasants, because when they were selling their crops, then they were not getting a lot of return which they could have got. And we find that the middlemen, those who were involved, they were earning a lot of money from the crops which were being purchased at a very lower rate. And we find that the debt also increased and of the peasants, and the peasants, they were not many times able to repay the loans which were being given to them, and the kind of advances which were being given to them, they also became less, and the production dropped. So we find that the cultivation of indigo and its commercialization did not have any kind of a developmental impact, as the factory system did not alter the means of production, which largely remained in the hands of the peasants. And we also see that how some scholars, they have seen that how the significant development was the experiment of the khuski cultivation, where we find that the cultivation was by the peasants of their own accord. And we find that this kind of a cultivation, as has been argued by B.B. Chaudhary, it did not crystallize into any well-defined shape. So any kind of changes which were coming in the context of the cultivation practices, we find that peasants, they were the worst sufferers in that sense, because the kind of demands which were being made from them in a way made them at some kind of a compromising position in the context of the merchants, and they were not able to get their due. And most of the benefits which could have occurred to them, they were being reaped by the merchants and the East India Company in terms of exporting the kind of cash crops which were grown by them. Apart from indigo, we also talk about tea, which was owned and managed by the whites in India. In Britain, it used to import tea from China, as we are all aware. And when their relations got strained in 1830s, we find that British, they were addicted to the Chinese tea in that sense, and attempts they were being made to grow tea in the hilly areas of northern Bengal and Assam. And the labor which was used in cultivation was of semi-servile nature. There was a severe labor hardships as well. So the cultivation in isolated areas was also being done, and we find that it is a kind of practice, especially tea. We will find that a lot of manual labor is being used. And in the plantation areas, we also see that how the labor, it was being exploited by the British planters. And because of the kind of violence which was being exercised by the British planters in the tea cultivation upon the labor which was available to them, we find that at the same time we will also find that the coming of the law which was being in a way imposed by the British in India through the modern laws which were there, we find that these planters even could not be punished by the Indian courts at all, because they were to be in a way dealt by the Europeans and the British judges. So in that context, the exploitation which was being carried out by the planters was immense. Then apart from tea, we also see that opium was another crop which was grown in negligible quantity in the areas near Patna. But the British, they encouraged its cultivation to replace the bullion in exchange for the Chinese tea and make balance of trade favorable. And the system of advance was also the basis of the poppy cultivation, and the production increased as well. So we find that how the British, in that sense, they favored the cultivation of opium, so that whatever tea which was going from China to Britain, it could be compensated through the export of opium to China. And in the British, they did not have to pay anything to Chinese in the framework of the bullion which they were paying for the purchase of tea. So this kind of a triangular trade which was being undertaken by the British was again to their own advantage, and this kind of a policy was in a way to drive the maximum revenue by exercising the monopoly control over the production and the sale of opium, which the British government does. And we find that poppy cultivation was also under a lot of heavy restrictions as well, and the system was not remunerative for the farmers, but it was coercive in nature. But at the same time, it was too remunerative for the Britishers, that the way peasants, they had to pay the high rent to sell the product only to the opium agents and not in open market, and that too at fixed prices. So in this way, the peasants, they were being exploited by the British agents. And we also find that during this time, the emergence of a new class called khatadars could also be seen. So we basically see that this kind of a policy which was being followed by the British in the context of the commercialization was very advantageous to the British interests, and British, they were ready to frame such kind of policies so that their supply chains were always there, whether in the framework of the kind of raw materials which were required by them. So opium definitely was one of the crops which in a way in the long run which helped the British in terms of the kind of bullion which they would have had to give to China. And at the same time, we also see that they were able to coerce the Indian farmers as well, and they were not the beneficiaries of the kind of money which was being generated by these cash crops. And when we talk about another crop, we find that jute was one where cultivation was non-existent before 1854-55, and the Crimean War, which cut off the supply of flax from Russia to Britain, led to the increased production to meet the foreign demand. And by the end of the 19th century, we find that jute became the largest export item from India. So we see that British, they were engaged in different kinds of policies with regard to the cultivation of the cash crops, but their main concern was to in a way exploit the agriculturalists or the peasants, those who were associated with it, and to maximize their revenue as well as maximize their profits. And in the supply chain, we find that more profits would have occurred to the farmers, but that could not be because of the kind of policies which were followed by the British in this context. And jute was not the only crop. We have already discussed that how indigo, for that matter, or opium for that matter, all these crops which were being grown in India, we find that British followed the same kind of a policy, and their main crux was to increase their revenue as well as and also in that sense to see that farmers they are being exploited by them, so that more and more kind of revenue or more kind of money is generated for the British. So the other aspects related to the commercialization of agriculture will be discussed in our next lecture. Thank you very much.